What's up, everyone? Aaron Nagler here for PackersNews.com, live on Facebook Monday afternoon. We've just heard from Mark Murphy and Brian Gutekunst, the new general manager for the Green Bay Packers. And we've been privy now to Mark Murphy's plans when it comes to the organizational structure for the Green Bay Packers heading forward under his watch. Today, the Packers very much becoming Mark Murphy's team. All three, the triumvirate of Brian Gutekunst, Russ Ball, and Mike McCarthy will all be reporting directly to Mark Murphy. A very unusual move in Green Bay, something that has happened and does happen around the league as far as head coaches reporting directly to ownership. Obviously, Murphy is not an owner, but he acts as one for the Packers. The Pittsburgh Steelers are probably the one team I can think of that most closely resemble what the Packers are doing. But in Green Bay, this is something we have not seen in 25 years since Bob Harlan made the call to hire Ron Wolf and gave him complete authority. In fact, it was that authority that made the job attractive to Wolf in the first place. So this is a pretty big break from tradition. Now, obviously, there have been moments in the last 25 years that have kind of strayed from that path, whether it was giving Mike Sherman the dual role of GM and head coach, whether it was Russ Ball getting more and more of the GM-type responsibilities without an actual title to go along with that. But this is the first time we have seen the Packers break up the top of that power structure, so to speak, rather than having it linear from president, CEO, to general manager, to head coach. Now we have president and CEO overseeing the cap guy, the GM, and the head coach, and all of them reporting directly to him. Obviously, I put my initial thoughts up on Twitter. I feel like this is a pretty big overcorrection to the way Ted Thompson ran things and not necessarily a reaction to how football operations has been structured for the last 25 years. Now, Murphy did kind of push back on that, saying that there were silos that have sprung up throughout the years in football operations that he wanted to break down. Interestingly enough, though, it sure seems as though he could potentially be building, destructing these silos that he speaks of and maybe potentially building three separate ones, cap, personnel, and coaching. But obviously this is all just initial reaction. It's impossible to say how this will be handled or kind of play out going forward. It will take a number of years to seemingly get any kind of concrete answer as to what kind of overseer Mark Murphy is going to be and how he's going to let these people operate. He did say at one point in the press conference that he wants to hire good people and let them do their job. However, at another point in the press conference, he also did mention that all three of these gentlemen will be meeting with him on a weekly basis, including Mike McCarthy. And when asked what he would be doing in those meetings with McCarthy, he mentioned possibly going over game plans. Now, some people are kind of pushed back on that at Twitter, say, well, he looked like he was caught off guard by the question or really didn't know what to say. Okay, initially, first off, that's a red flag. You've got to have some kind of idea if you're meeting with these people. If you've deemed it necessary to make this change, there has to be a very specific thing you are thinking about when it comes to why you need to meet with the head coach every single week as the head of the organization. And the idea that McCarthy would have to talk to Mark Murphy about game plans, that is a major, major red flag. That has, throughout the history of the NFL, been a recipe for disaster when, quote-unquote, ownership, which, again, obviously Murphy is not an owner, but he acts as one, is anywhere near game planning. That is a recipe for disaster. Anyway, those are my initial thoughts, my initial feelings on what we've seen so far. Obviously, a lot of interest here, a lot of people chiming in. Let's see what you fine folks have to say on this Monday afternoon. Jason starts us off. Do you find it contradictory that Murphy says that I see what you're saying about Brian Gutekunst having the power to hire and fire a coach? Obviously has to kind of consult with Murphy, but now has to be stuck with McCarthy for at least 2 years, given that McCarthy was just giving a contract extension. It is interesting in the sense that Murphy just last week said the new GM would have the power to hire and fire whoever the head coach was, including Mike McCarthy. Now it would seem that has changed, and I can't help but feel that Gutekunst's sojourn down to Houston played some part. Murphy seemed to indicate as much, as far as tipping the scales towards not wanting to lose Gutekunst from the building, and having that kind of play into why he decided it was time to keep him in the fold by giving him the general manager spot, but making it so that they weren't going to lose Mike McCarthy. Mike McCarthy is a clear winner here today. There's no doubt about that. He's gained just a little bit more power in the kind of ladder towards the ownership / CEO. And yeah, I'm with you. It is a bit contradictory. And like I just said, it kind of flies in the face of why this team and franchise has been so successful for the last 25 years. Does this mean that Mike McCarthy and the GM are on a tight leash? That's a good question. I think the pressure is on McCarthy either way. He gets more power, and has a very good relationship with Gutekunst. Obviously, Brian said as much today in his press conference. But I think, everything Tom Silverstein wrote for us yesterday, which was in Morning Buzz this morning, it still stands. McCarthy with a 2-year deal, he's got to win this year. And they've got to win pretty big, I would think. They can't go stumbling out of the gate or miss the playoffs again, because if they do, the Packers would have no problem kicking McCarthy to the curb and starting over at coach with only 1 year left on his deal. Obviously, he did get that extension, but that's simply to give him a little bit of breathing room. But I think as far as what kind of leash he's on, I think, he's made it clear what he wants as far as a general manager who will be active. And, he's both publicly and behind the scenes expressed his frustrations with Ted Thompson and the roster over the last couple years. And Gutekunst made no bones today about how they will be in on everything. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean they will make every move, but it sure seemed like an attempt to kind of move past this kind of malaise that has set over the Packers for the last few years when it comes to free agency. Now, those are words, and the only thing that will really move the needle here are actual actions, so we'll see how that plays out. If Gut didn't want McCarthy as the head coach, he wouldn't have taken the job. I very much agree with that statement. I absolutely take him at his word for what he said this afternoon about his respect for McCarthy as a coach and as a man. There was a lot of speculation when he withdrew from the 49ers job because they were dead set on getting a coach, namely Kyle Shanahan. And at the time, that speculation was about him wanting to pick his own head coach. But it sure seems, from all indications, that McCarthy, he's more than comfortable with Mike McCarthy as his head coach, at least to start. You always said that Big Mike is one of the top coaches in the NFL. Do you still believe it? I do. I absolutely do. Obviously he had a very down year this year. I think a big part of that is what he was stuck with at backup quarterback. I do think he was stubborn in the fact that he stuck with Hundley as long as he did. Not that Joe Callahan was going to come in and light the world on fire. But, and I do think, some of the roster things caught up with them. But I also think McCarthy is one stubborn guy, and he does need to kind of adjust himself a little bit. I do find it interesting that he's kind of getting the band back together with Joe Philbin, bringing back, for the wide receivers coach, someone he worked with in San Francisco. Obviously, I don't doubt that he has this feeling of being a little bit besieged, wants to get his guys in place, and come out gunning in 2018. Is Elliott Wolf going to Cleveland or staying until the GM job opens up? All in caps. I will be absolutely shocked if Elliott Wolf sticks around. There's absolutely nothing as far as, in reporting. I've checked. I can't get anything out of anybody at 1265 about where Elliott is headed. I do know that he's obviously unhappy with their decision. I think Ron Wolf, his father, made it pretty public about how he was upset with the decision by choosing his words. And I know there's a report out there that John Dorsey is waiting for Elliott with open arms. So that may not be the only place that opens their doors to Elliott in the next day or two. He is under contract for next season, but I can't imagine the Packers forcing him to stay after everything that's gone down, after elevating him up the chain of command year after year, after denying him not only the ability or the opportunity to interview in Detroit a couple years ago, but also to interview in Philadelphia the year before that. People have kind of forgotten that part of it. So there's been numerous opportunities. They've kind of blocked Elliott along the way. At this point, I can't imagine them doing so again. So is Hundley not the backup QB anymore? That's one of the questions that Brian Gutekunst will have to answer throughout the course of these next few weeks and months. Why does everyone think Wolf is so great? His name carries more weight than actual talent. Kyle, I would throw that around at you and say, how do you know he's not so great? We don't know really a whole lot about any of these guys. I can only tell you from talking to Elliott throughout the years, I am pretty confident that he would be an aggressive roster builder. He would use all avenues available to him. I think he's a shrewd eye for talent, and I think he has a really healthy attitude towards the modern trappings of being a general manager in the NFL. Now, is he going to be a GM someday? Mark Murphy seemed to say so. In fact, he did say exactly that during his press conference today. Now, will he be a successful general manager? Only time will tell if and when it happens. Mark, bring back Forrest Gregg. I tell you what, this is the power structure, the type of power structure that was in place when Forrest Gregg was coach. In my opinion, this reduces internal power struggle and lets everyone focus and succeed on what they're best at. That is 1,000% what Mark Murphy is hoping. There's no doubt about that. No Bart Starr jokes. Oh, I don't know, Gary. If Mike McCarthy is meeting with Mark Murphy to go over his game plans, it's going to be real hard not to make some Bart Starr meeting with the board or the executive committee every Monday after a game. Because that actually happened. Can you imagine that? Mike McCarthy having to go in front of the executive committee or the Packers board every Monday to talk about the game? I mean, we're not too far away from that if Murphy starts talking to Mike McCarthy about game plans. I'm just saying. How do you feel about the future of Clay Matthews and Morgan Burnett? I think Clay Matthews will be back on a restructured deal. I think he's a pretty important piece of their defense, even though he is not the dynamic playmaker he used to be. Now, that will take some significant restructuring if they want to extend his deal and not take I think it's close to $15 million cap hit that he's scheduled to have next year. But I do think Gutekunst will try to get him back in that regard. As for Morgan Burnett, that's a really tricky one. I thought Michael Cohen made a really good point in our video yesterday where he said that is the type of guy who Ted Thompson will probably let him walk. He'll be going on to his third contract. He's getting up there in age, and he has kind of started to show signs of his body kind of breaking down. He really can't. He does get injured quite a bit. But we don't know how Gutekunst is going to operate. He did mention today wanting to have competition throughout the roster at every position. I think safety would be no different. But it's going to, that is going to be one of the questions that we're going to, have to take this offseason to see how he operates. I would probably bring Morgan back if they were continuing down, if they were staying in-house and if the next defensive coordinator is running anything close to what Dom Capers ran, I'd probably want to bring him back. But if it's a clean break and they hire a coordinator who is, say, implementing a 4-3 scheme or even a 3-4 scheme that's not kind of zone dog based, then I'd probably let him go. But that, again, is only Brian Gutekunst to answer that question. Surprised they're taking this long to pick a defensive coordinator. Thoughts? I'm not surprised. Vic Fangio is set to be a free agent, as is Gus Bradley as of tomorrow. I would think McCarthy's most likely interested in talking to one or both of them. And, after interviewing their internal candidates, there's a number of guys still out there across the league. Not really surprised, and I also think they wanted to get this general manager thing squared away first. Mike McCarthy's responsibility squared away so that any potential candidates that they're talking to, they can give them definitive answers as opposed to, we really don't know what the structure is going to be or what Mike's situation is. Now they can go forward and say, this is how it's set up, this is McCarthy's power, this is what he has control of, and this is what you'd be signing on to. So I'm not too surprised. We need to go back to a 4-3 scheme. We won the Super Bowl playing the 4-3. Yeah, they won a Super Bowl playing the 3-4. Do you think we sign more free agents under Gutekunst? I think they'll definitely look at more free agents under Gutekunst. Whether they sign them, that's another matter. But I think they'll definitely be more active. As he said today, they will be in on everything, meaning they'll be actively looking at everything on the market rather than, basically 1265 Lombardi shutting down the first week of free agency for the most part throughout the last 10 years. Any idea on Rodgers-McCarthy relationship with Gutekunst? Well, I know McCarthy and Brian are close and have seemingly worked very well together. They speak highly of each other, both publicly and in private. As for Rodgers, I don't really know. I don't know much. I haven't seen much interaction between Rodgers and Gutekunst. That doesn't mean they haven't. Doesn't mean they, obviously doesn't mean much of anything. But for McCarthy's part, I know he's probably very pleased by this move. We need an outside hire for defensive coordinator. Justin, I tend to agree. Although I wouldn't, just write off somebody if they did if they did hire a Darren Perry or a Joe Witt. I wouldn't necessarily think that they're going to continue on the same path they were down with Capers, but I do agree that I think fresh blood is needed, so to speak, on that side of the ball. Mark, can you mix me an old-fashioned? No. My wife makes a really good old-fashioned, though. What impact does the new GM have on the draft, types of players? That's really tough to say until we, have a few years of draft history to fall back on. That was the thing with Ted. Going into each and every draft at this point, after 10 years, you really knew data points and what he looks for and what he leans towards and what he shies away from. With Gutekunst, we're not really going to have much of an idea until we see him, have a draft class or two. I know you were big on Wolf, but do you think Brian Gutekunst is a good hire? I do. I very much do. It's funny. Somebody was going back and liking on Twitter all my past praise for Gutekunst. And I try not to retweet compliments, but you can check back on my timeline. There's stuff from 2013, from 2014, where I call Brian a rising star. One tweet I said he's going to be a GM sooner rather than later. I've always figured he was going to be in charge of his own shop. I did wonder if it was going to be in Green Bay, but it turns out that is the case. And yes, I think he's a fantastic hire, and I think he'll do a very good job. How much is left in the tank for Nelson and Cobb? I think there's much more in Cobb's tank than in Nelson's, but I do think Nelson is an asset for the offense as long as Aaron Rodgers is the quarterback. Their chemistry is unmatched. They know each other so well. They read defenses the exact same way, and that's the key. For Nelson, when they're running, especially against zone, he knows where to sit down. He knows how to read things exactly as Rodgers is reading them, and that's why you're going to see production out of the two of them. That's why you saw production early in the year. But, obviously his ability as far as a deep threat, those days are gone. He is a crafty route runner. That's how he got deep on the play that should have been a touchdown that Rodgers underthrew him in Carolina. Like I said, he's still a valuable piece. I am interested to see if they ask him to take a pay cut and or a reduction in salary, though. Gutekunst is a UWL grad. Very good, Jeff. What are the pros, cons of Murphy's newfound involvement on the front office? It's a good question, Matt. I mean, it's all guesswork at this point because we don't know exactly how active he's going to be. And it's clear that there were things going on the football side that he did not appreciate and or think were working as far as, he kept referencing things during the interview process coming up that silos that had developed in the organization that he wanted to break down. So I would tend to think what he really wants to facilitate is communication from all parties. And it sure sounds like things had calcified in that regard over the last few years. Now, the danger, obviously, is that you don't want anybody on the business side meddling with football. Essentially, throughout the NFL, throughout the history of the league, that has always led to bad things. I do remember, I think it was Cliff Crystal who wrote a column a few years ago about how the more that the board and or executive committee are involved on the football side, the worse the Packers have been. Throughout history, that has always been the case. And I know Mark Murphy is not the board or the executive committee, but he is a member of both. And he is obviously in touch with all of those people, and all of those people can inform his opinions and or attitudes. And having someone influenced by the board and or executive committee being so closely affiliated and involved with the football side, it's a dangerous thing. And I know there will be so many people who poo-poo this and tell me I'm crazy, and that's fine, and you're right, I'm totally nuts. But I will say history bears that out, not only in Green Bay, but throughout the history of the league. So, as I started this video by saying, and I will probably repeat myself until I'm old and doddering in a home somewhere, this could either be a big step forward in the evolution of the Green Bay Packers or the beginning of a backslide into the morass that was existent before Bob Harlan rescued the franchise. And again, only time will tell. What's Mike McCarthy's joke about the trade deadline? I remember that very well when he said to Bill Huber. Bill Huber asked him about the trade deadline 2 years ago, and he said, "What's it like around here the night before the trade deadline?" And McCarthy responded, "The trade deadline? I thought that was last week." And there was this pause of confusion, and Bill says, "No, I'm pretty sure it's tomorrow." And Mike goes, "That's what it's like." Meaning that, no one talks about the trade deadline, and it's completely empty because they never made trades. To that end, yes, I think Gutekunst will be much more active as far as roster construction. Now, maybe not trades per se or in particular, but I do think he'll explore those avenues and be part of those conversations in ways that Thompson was not. Do you think Rodgers had any input on the GM? I tend to doubt it. Murphy did make it pretty clear last week that, Rodgers, while being obviously the most important player in the franchise, he is a player. And, on the football end of it, decision-making, that's his job, and he was going to take care of that. But on the other hand, he did also say last week that the general manager would have the power to hire and fire the head coach, and that's certainly not going to be the case. Let's see. Why do I just trust redheads so much? I just can't trust Murphy. Man, that sounds like a personal issue. All right, I'm going to have to leave it there. Thanks so much, everyone. I'm sorry if I didn't get your question. They do fly by very fast, but I will undoubtedly be back tomorrow when whatever new news breaks happens upon us. So make sure you're here at PackersNews.com on Facebook. Make sure you're checking PackersNews.com for all the latest. We'll have everything from today's developments and everything throughout the offseason, leading obviously up to the draft and then the offseason program. So thanks a lot, everyone. I'll most likely talk to you tomorrow. Have a good day.